How's it going, guys? Welcome back to Fibs Reacts, and welcome to my review of The Mandalorian and Grogu. I know the video format's a little different today, but you guys just won't get to see my handsome mug. So before we get into the review, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss any new videos. Alright, so The Mandalorian and Grogu is our first Star Wars film in 7 years. The last Star Wars movie that was actually released in the theaters was The Rise of Skywalker. Now before I get into my thoughts about the actual movie, I would just like to talk about my experience of getting a snack for this movie. So I showed up early to the theater, you know, like you do, and I was looking over at the concession stand, going back and forth in my mind as to whether or not I was going to get a snack. And finally, about 15 minutes before the movie started, I decided to get in line. And so I get to the front and I'm looking at all the options, and they had the prices written very small, which whether or not that was a strategic choice, I have no idea. So I got a combo. It was a drink, a popcorn, and candy. When the cashier rang it up, it showed like 30 bucks. And I was like, no. I was like, this has got to be a mistake. Like, there's no way. And so I even looked down like at the display screen to see what was on my tab. And sure enough, it was just that combo. $30. 30 bucks. I cannot believe. So anyway, after I was robbed at the concession stand, I went into the movie. First thing I'm gonna say, this should not have been a movie. Now listen, I love The Mandalorian, the first 2 seasons of the TV show. But that being said, this should not have been a movie because number one, the movie ultimately ended up feeling just like watching an extended episode of the show. Because ultimately, it just kind of felt like one giant side quest. Like there really was nothing about this movie that contributed to the overall lore of Star Wars. And also I feel like this movie was a little too late. I feel like if this would have been released, you know, kind of during the craze and the hype of The Mandalorian, which at this point, you know, was about 5 or so years ago. But if they wanted to do a movie, the ideal time to have released this would have been like back in 2023-ish. I just feel like it's a bit too late and it kind of just missed the bus. Because I don't think people are as hype about The Mandalorian as they were 5 or so years ago. Now, a lot of the reviews I had read going into this movie were mainly like, oh, it's really fun. Oh, it's really entertaining. Oh, it's a great popcorn movie. Which is all fine and good, but at the same time, that typically means there really isn't much of a story. So let me tell you, if you want to see The Mandalorian fight a bunch of CGI monsters, do I have a movie for you? And I had a thought about halfway through the movie. Honestly, the only real thing I am seeing right now is The Mandalorian. I tell you what, like aside from the very few scenes where there are other human characters, everything else is green screen, is CGI, or puppets, or animatronics, which just makes it feel like a giant video game. There was something about like the original trilogy in particular that made it feel real and made it feel practical. And a lot of it was because they used practical effects in the original trilogy. And that was because of the limitations in technology at the time. So for example, in Return of the Jedi, they didn't have the means to make Jabba the Hutt entirely CGI. Like that just simply wasn't an option back then. And so what did they have to do? They had to make a giant puppet that was controlled by like 10 different people. There was something about seeing that version of a Hutt that was just different than the version of the Hutts that we see in this movie. And there were just a lot of things in this movie that were CGI that I feel like didn't really need to be CGI. For example, it seemed like they weren't really on location for a majority of this. A lot of this looked like it was shot in front of a green screen, or I guess the volume in this case. And there were certain scenes where it was blaringly obvious that the subject was standing in front of a green screen. Like Zeb was entirely CGI or maybe mocap, either one. But there was something about Zeb in particular that just looked off to me. Like it just, like he just didn't really look very real, like didn't really look very good. Same thing goes for Imbo, which by the way, I think the inclusion of Imbo in this movie was really badass because Imbo, ever since I watched The Clone Wars, has been my favorite bounty hunter. Like, you could tell that was definitely had to be a Dave Filoni choice. But even Imbo, I think, was entirely CGI. And I'm like, man, like, you couldn't have found like a tall, lanky guy who who you could have dressed up as Imbo. Overall, it did have the appearance of more of a TV budget type project, which again is why I think this just should have been a season of the show as opposed to a movie. I mean, hell, you could basically see the cuts between episodes in this movie. Now let's talk a little bit about Jeremy Allen White as Rada the Hutt. Now, for those of you who may not remember, Rada the Hutt was the little Hutt character that was kind of the main focal point of the Star Wars The Clone Wars movie, and basically he's all grown up now and he is this giant buff warrior Hutt character who's basically like a gladiator. Now, the thing that I found really redundant was that the main plot of the Clone Wars movie was Rada the Hutt had been kidnapped, and one of the main plots of this movie was Rada the Hutt had been kidnapped and he was gonna go get him. I was like, man, we've seen this before. What is Rada the Hutt's deal and being kidnapped? Like, he has quite a knack for that. Seeing a Hutt creature fight the way he did, I think they did really well, because when it was first announced that Rada was gonna be like a gladiator, I was like, man, like, how is that gonna work? Like, how is a Hutt creature gonna fight like that? But I think in that aspect, like, they did a really good job of showing what that would kind of look like. Which, by the way, the gladiator fight with Mando and Rada versus all the creatures, that was obviously a nod to holochess. I just had to point that out. But the fact that they made such a big deal about Jeremy Allen White being cast as Rada, it didn't make any sense when I finally saw the movie. And the reason being is because they pitched down his voice. Honestly, in retrospect, it could have been anybody. Like, why would you cast a known actor and spend, I'm sure, a good amount of money to hire him when all you were gonna do was just pitch his voice down anyway? To the point where, like, you really couldn't even tell it was Jeremy Allen White. The action sequences, in particular with the Mandalorian himself, I think were choreographed very well. I like the fighting style that they've developed for the Mandalorian. It's very quick, it's very ruthless. For some reason in my head, it kind of reminded me of Batman for some reason. Mando is almost like the Batman of the Star Wars universe. Now, one of the things I will say, I think, that has been pretty consistent over all of the Star Wars movies, even the sequels, is the music. I think for the most part, Star Wars always hits it home with the music. And then of course for The Mandalorian, you had Ludwig Göransson, who, by the way, I think created a very iconic theme for The Mandalorian. I think he absolutely nailed the theme for The Mandalorian. And he also did the score for this movie, and it very much shows because I do very much enjoy the Mandalorian soundtrack. And finally, I wanted to talk about Grogu himself. Now, I'm just gonna say it, you know, I like The Mandalorian. I'm not too fond of Grogu himself. Like, I think in the TV show, I liked Grogu because for the most part, at least in the beginning, all he did was stay in his little hover stroller, and he just kind of accompanied Mando on all his missions, and he provided, you know, some comedic relief here and there. But I feel like ever since Grogu kind of started moving on his own and kind of doing his own thing, I don't know, it just became really campy for me. And it got to the point where, honestly, by the end of this movie, I was so sick of seeing Grogu's face. Now, there was a touching moment, like, towards the end of the movie where Mando had basically been, like, sedated by poison, and Grogu took care of him over the course of a couple days. And I thought that was, you know, very touching and kind of showed their bond. But aside from that, man, especially when you brought in the four dumbasses. Oh my gosh, those guys were so annoying. See, and it's things like that that I just think really bring down Star Wars a lot. I don't know what it is about anytime they release a new Star Wars project, there always has to be some little alien or robot sidekick that, I mean, let's be honest, is just used so they can sell toys. It's used so they can market it towards kids, and kids are gonna want the plushies and the action figures. And so I found a lot of the scenes with Grogu and the four dumbasses to be just really annoying, really childish, really campy, just did not appeal to me at all. Again, the reason I liked the Mandalorian show, at least in the beginning, was that Grogu kind of took a back seat, and it was mostly about Din Djarin. It was mostly about the Mandalorian himself as a character. But Grogu really came to the forefront of this movie, and I just wasn't crazy about it. So to kind of sum up here, you know, my overall thoughts on this movie, was it terrible? No. Like, if you just want to turn your brain off for 2 hours and just watch a bunch of Star Wars CGI and explosions, then this is the movie for you. But again, this movie did not contribute anything to Star Wars as a whole. Honestly, I feel like if they are going to release a Star Wars movie, in my opinion, it needs to have the main core of what Star Wars is, and that is the Force, it's the Jedi, it's the Sith, the light side and the dark side. That is the core of Star Wars. Anything outside of that, I'm not saying it's bad, but it doesn't deserve a feature film. Like, for example, Solo. As much as I love Solo, yeah, that's right, I said it. What you gonna do? Let's be honest, it could have been a TV show. And I feel like it should have been a TV show. Now, the other spin-off Star Wars movie we got, which being Rogue One, I feel like that is kind of an exception because let's be honest, Rogue One is basically Star Wars episode 3.5 because Rogue One directly connects to A New Hope. And also Rogue One is phenomenal. But yeah, if you're gonna make a Star Wars movie, it can't be this. It can't be the Mandalorian and Grogu's side quest. This is not a movie I would necessarily be jumping to rewatch. It had its charm here and there, but overall, it just felt unnecessary. And honestly, towards the end of the movie, I was kind of checking the time. I was wondering when this movie was gonna be over, which I don't think I've ever done in a Star Wars movie before. Except maybe The Last Jedi. Although I think I was in a coma when I was watching that movie. I was so bored. Now, all of this to say, I think Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau, I do think they have the best intentions for Star Wars. And I do think they have the ability to tell good stories. I just kind of think this was a swing and a miss. So there you have it, guys. That is my review of The Mandalorian and Grogu. Let me know your thoughts on this movie in the comments below. Hope to see you on the next one. And as always, catch you later.